When I was around 9 or 10 years old, though the exact age escapes me, I rode my bike to school one morning, the crisp air biting at my skin. My grandmother trailed behind me, always making sure I arrived safely. The routine was familiar, the path well-worn, and as I neared the corner leading to the school's back gate, I noticed a silver car idling just ahead. It could have been an old Corolla, or something similar, nothing too distinct, nothing that should have caught my attention. Yet, something about it did. Cars stopping at that corner was normal, parents often dropped their kids off there before heading to work. But as I approached, I realized there were no children in the vehicle. The driver was a man, sitting motionless, his hands resting on the wheel, his gaze fixed on me. A predator studying its prey. An unsettling chill crawled up my spine. He wasn't waiting for a child to hop out. He was waiting for me to get closer. I hesitated, my hands tightening on the handlebars of my bike. The rational part of my brain screamed that I was overreacting, that he was just another adult minding his business. But then, in an instant, instinct took over. I turned sharply, wheeling back toward my grandmother. The moment my direction changed, the silver car lurched forward and sped off, disappearing around the corner as if the driver had never been there at all. I didn't mention it to my grandmother. Maybe I didn't want to believe that something sinister had just unfolded. Maybe I thought I had imagined it. Weeks passed. The memory faded into the background, blending into the dull hum of everyday life. Then, during the school holidays, I stayed at my grandmother's house, as I often did. My tiny dog, a miniature schnauzer mixed with a toy poodle, was with me, his little paws padding excitedly across the tile floor. Since my grandmother's yard had no grass, I took him across the road to a vacant lot so he could relieve himself. It was a quiet afternoon. The kind of silence that lulls you into a false sense of security. As my dog sniffed around, I glanced both ways before stepping back onto the road. That was when I saw it. A silver car. The same silver car. It was moving toward me at a slow, deliberate pace. I could see the driver now, his face partially obscured by the glare of the sun on the windshield. But I knew. I knew it was the same man from that morning weeks ago. I knew, deep in my bones, that he had found me again. My heart slammed against my ribs. My breath hitched. I scooped up my dog and bolted across the street, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't stop until I was inside my grandmother's house, my back pressed against the door, lungs burning from the sprint. Peeking through the fly screen, I watched as the silver car crept by, the driver's head slowly turning toward the house, his gaze sweeping over it, searching for me. I never saw him again after that. But even now, the memory lingers, a shadow lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering reminders of the danger that once stalked me so patiently, so persistently. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, paranoia tightening its grip on me like a vice. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the street, half expecting to see that silver car lurking in the distance. The rational part of me wanted to believe he was gone, that he had simply given up and moved on. But deep down, I knew better. One night, as the wind howled through the trees outside my grandmother's house, I lay awake in bed, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room. My tiny dog curled up beside me, oblivious to the unease that settled in my chest like a lead weight. Then, I heard it. The faintest sound of gravel crunching outside. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. Was it just the wind? An animal? Or something far worse? Slipping out of bed, I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. My fingers trembled as I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside. There, parked across the street, was the silver car. My stomach turned to ice. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, I could see the silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat, unmoving. Watching. Panic surged through me. I ducked beneath the window, pressing my back against the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced. Should I wake my grandmother? Should I call the police? What if he was waiting for me to step outside? Minutes stretched into eternity. When I finally found the courage to peek out again, the car was gone. No trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen. Sleep never came that night. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But no matter how much I tried, the fear remained, a constant reminder that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. The next morning, I told my grandmother about the car. She frowned, concern etching lines into her face as she listened. "Are you sure it was the same one?" she asked, her voice careful, as if she didn't want to scare me further. "I know it was," I insisted. "It was parked right across the street last night, just sitting there. Watching." She pursed her lips, glancing toward the window as if expecting to see it there now. "If you see it again, tell me immediately. And don't go outside alone." I nodded, but her words did little to settle the fear that had taken root inside me. That afternoon, I sat in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, but my attention kept drifting toward the window. The street outside was empty, the wind stirring the trees into a slow, rhythmic dance. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was nearby. As evening approached, my grandmother double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The house felt smaller, more suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me. I stayed in the living room with her, pretending to watch TV while the sun dipped below the horizon. Then, just as night settled over the neighborhood, the phone rang. My grandmother answered it, her face tightening as she listened. "Hello?" A pause. Then her eyes flicked toward me. "Who is this?" I watched her, my breath shallow, my skin prickling with unease. She held the phone away from her ear, staring at it for a moment before setting it back down on the receiver. "Wrong number," she muttered, but there was something in her expression, something unreadable. I didn't believe her. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window sent my heart hammering in my chest. My dog, usually curled up at my feet, sat alert on the bed, ears perked, as if he sensed my fear. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The sound of tires rolling slowly over gravel. The tires crunched over the gravel, slow and deliberate, each movement sending a wave of dread through me. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound came closer, creeping like a predator stalking its prey. My fingers dug into the bedsheets as I forced myself to move, inching toward the window. My dog whimpered beside me, sensing my unease. With a trembling hand, I lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to peer outside. There it was. The silver car idled at the end of the driveway, its headlights off, its silhouette barely visible under the moonlight. The driver's window was down. I could make out the faint outline of a face, watching. Waiting. A chill coiled around my spine, paralyzing me. I wanted to scream, to wake my grandmother, but fear clamped down on my throat. What if he heard me? What if he got out of the car and tried to get inside? I dropped the curtain and stumbled back, chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. My dog barked, a sharp, high-pitched sound that shattered the silence. The car's engine revved, and in an instant, it peeled away from the driveway, vanishing into the darkness. Shaking, I ran to my grandmother's room and shook her awake. "He was here," I whispered frantically. The car was outside. He was watching. She was alert in an instant, reaching for the phone. "We're calling the police." Minutes later, a patrol car arrived, its flashing lights painting eerie patterns on the walls. 2 officers stepped inside, their faces unreadable as I recounted everything: the silver car, the driver, the way he seemed to be waiting for something. One officer nodded grimly. "We'll patrol the area tonight and keep an eye out. If you see the car again, call us immediately." I nodded, gripping my dog tightly as the officers left. The house felt different now, less like a safe haven, more like a trap. Sleep didn't come that night. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't over. The days that followed were filled with a tense, uneasy silence. My grandmother kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked at all times, and insisted that I never be alone, even for a second. I felt like a prisoner in the house, but I didn't argue. I knew the danger was real. The police patrolled the area for a few nights, but the silver car never returned. At least, not while they were watching. A part of me wanted to believe it was over, that the driver had finally given up. But something inside me whispered that he was still out there, waiting for the right moment. One evening, my grandmother left to run a quick errand, promising to be back in less than an hour. She triple-checked the locks before leaving, and I sat curled up on the couch, my tiny dog nestled against me, watching the minutes crawl by on the clock. Then, a knock at the door. I froze. It was too soon for my grandmother to be back. The knock came again, louder this time. My dog lifted his head, his ears twitching, a low growl rumbling in his tiny chest. Slowly, I crept toward the peephole, my pulse hammering in my ears. I held my breath as I peeked outside. No one was there. A cold dread slithered through me. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps moving away from the door, crunching softly over the gravel driveway. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I didn't look out the window. I couldn't. When my grandmother returned, I practically ran to her, spilling everything in a frantic rush. Her face darkened, and without hesitation, she called the police again. They arrived within minutes, but there was nothing to find. No footprints. No sign of forced entry. No silver car lurking nearby. Just an empty driveway and my lingering fear. After that night, my grandmother never let me stay at her house alone again. The police continued patrolling for a while, but eventually, the visits stopped. And as time passed, the fear lessened, settling into a distant memory. But I never truly forgot. Even now, years later, I find myself glancing over my shoulder when I walk alone. Watching for a car that shouldn't be there. Listening for footsteps in the dark. Because somewhere out there, he's still waiting. And I know, deep down, that if he ever finds me again, this time, I won't be lucky enough to run.